Believe everyone is in here. We'll go ahead and get started. Just a reminder that this will be recorded for the session. And my name is Ernest Stockton. I serve as a reentry coordinator for the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. And I first want to say thank you for joining us with today's presentation. As you can see, the topic is crime, incarceration, and grief, self-care and caring for others. We have joining us today our presenters are Caitlin Arndt and Donna McCartney, and they'll be here to inform us and enlighten us on what this really means and how we can make this applicable in our day-to-day. Also, just a little house rules. You are on mute. We will have questions for Q&A. They like to have that at the end part if you can. We'll have this divided up into two different pieces. And then at the end, we'll have time for question and answers. Also, I will allow the presenters to introduce themselves, their organizations, their area, and all that information. But if you do have any questions, we are keeping an eye on the chat. Please enter your questions, your comments, whatever you may have, statements in there, and we'll look at those and we'll kind of shift through those accordingly as well. But please stay on mute and we will have Q&A at the end. Thank you very much. And I will pass the baton to Caitlin.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Caitlin Arndt, and I am the Education and Outreach Program Coordinator for Fernside Center for Grieving Children. Fernside is a nonprofit that's located in Cincinnati. We're actually the nation's second oldest children's grief center. And so myself and my wonderful colleague Donna are excited to be here with you this afternoon.
And my name is Donna McCartney. I am a grief counselor with the Goldstien Family Grief Center with Hospice of Cincinnati. We are an affiliate of Fernside, and Goldstien are both affiliates of Hospice of Cincinnati, and we are excited to be here today. We know that we are talking about something that can feel very heavy, and I know that you guys have taken in a lot today, so we are thankful that you are here. We hope to offer opportunities for education, to answer questions, but to also think about ways in which you can take care of yourselves and take care of others from a grief perspective. Caitlin, you want to go over to the objectives?
Yes. Maybe. Oh boy. There we go.
So we're going to talk about different types of loss people experience and the impact of grief on individuals. Talk about the different ways we experience grief as a result of incarceration, and to recognize the impact of grief and on children and adolescents, and recognizing the difference in the grief experiences at different stages and ages in development. I think the one thing that we often like to start with is the recognition of who experiences grief. We often think about grief in regards to death, and in reality, anyone who has experienced a loss has the potential to experience any number of grief reactions. I think it's important to acknowledge that the grief that is experienced by infants, toddlers, youth, and adolescents is different than grief that is experienced by adults, and that grief experienced by the elderly has some different components as well. So we want to acknowledge that at all stages and phases in development, we can experience grief reactions. And outside of a death experience, things that we may experience grief over can be things like incarceration, addiction, divorce, loss of a job, lots of other examples that aren't on there, but the foster care system, adoption, moving. There are several other things that can result in grief experiences. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because oftentimes we can find overlap in those experiences. And so that can complicate the grief process. We do want to provide some of the definitions from a grief perspective. And I think it's important because we're using sometimes new language to apply to things that are very familiar. And I think when we have language, it is helpful in understanding a little bit more and also giving ourselves a little bit more grace as we navigate the grief experiences. We talk about acute grief, as that early period of loss. I think that is the time frame in which we give ourselves the greatest ability to grieve. Because of our cultural understanding of grief, we think that grief is that outward expression. We think of people as grieving when they are crying, when they are upset, when we are experiencing those emotions. But that is the early stages of grief. And we continue to carry that grief with us over the course of time. There is a period of adapting to loss, which is accepting the reality and figuring out how grief and loss can work towards becoming integrated. And then integrated grief is the lasting form of grief. And we recognize grief within the grief world, that this is something that we live with. A lot of times people come in and working with individuals who are grieving, they want to know what they need to do to get over grief. And when we have losses that are impacting our lives significantly, grief isn't something that we get over, but rather it is something that we learn to live with. It is something that we carry with us. It's not always as intense as it is in the beginning, but it is absolutely something that we do carry over the course of our lives. Prolonged grief disorder came upon recently, and that is a DSM diagnosis for those who have persistent, pervasive grief reactions that do impact their ability to function. And what we know from a prolonged grief disorder perspective is that is going to impact those who don't have the opportunity to actively grieve. They don't have the support that they need, or they have incredibly complex grief and loss experiences. So we think of grief, we often think of sadness. Culturally, I think we have drawn a equals line between the two. When we are grieving, we are sad. And I think that when we start thinking about all of the emotions that come about from a grief perspective, we recognize that many of those make sense from a grief perspective. But grief is so much more than sadness. It is anger, it can be guilt, it can be anxiety, it can be helplessness and shock and denial. There can be aspects of relief that we experience in grief. And it can also present as irritability and upset. So when we recognize that all of these emotions have the potential to come about from a grief perspective, I think we can understand a little bit more about why we may be feeling these things or why those we are supporting may be feeling those things. Grief also impacts our behaviors. It impacts the way we sleep. It impacts the way we eat. It impacts the way we practice different activities in our daily life. We might find ourselves avoiding things. We might find ourselves doing a lot of excessive life review. So it's a recognition of we can change our behaviors, and behavioral changes can be a part of the grief experience. Physical sensations, a lot of the things that we may associate with anxiety, that tightness we feel in our chest, that hollow feeling in the pit of our stomach, GI issues, headaches, crying, all of those are physical sensations that we can associate with the grief experience. And there are cognitive changes that we experience as a result of the grief process. And oftentimes people come in, and I'm working primarily with individuals who have experienced a loss related to a death. But in any instances of loss, when we are preoccupied by the loss, we aren't fully present in other aspects of life in the same way that we may have been. So it can impact our cognition. We're distracted. We're not remembering things the way that we used to. Variables that impact grief. I think that this is one of the things that's important to acknowledge, that there are so many different variables that impact grief. Our relationship with the person who may be deceased or may be incarcerated, or the situation we may have been removed from somebody from a relationship perspective. Degrees of ambivalence, the circumstances surrounding the loss. And I think when our loss is related to incarceration, there's such significant stigma surrounding that. And it is something that we need to be able to acknowledge, to recognize, and to make sure that we are making support and resources available despite the stigma that we might be associating with it. Personality and coping behaviors of the bereaved person is going to very much impact how we express and experience our grief. Social support, We know that a number of people who are incarcerated do experience grief and loss, but they may not have the support system that they need or the support system that they would be looking for surrounding them during that time. There are cultural and religious implications, and obviously the health and lifestyle of a bereaved person. Now, these are all variables that impact the grief experience. And we talk about these variables in a lot of different presentations. And I think that when we look at these variables, it's important that that is the things we want to consider for the grief experience of each person as they are navigating it. We tend to use variables to compare different people's experiences, and we really need to be cognizant to recognize the uniqueness of each grief experience and not draw comparisons when we're looking at these variables, but use these variables as a way to understand the grief experiences of an individual person. When we are talking about grief experiences related to incarceration, who is experiencing that grief? And I think it is those who are themselves incarcerated. It is the loved ones who are no longer able to be present and be the support person for their people that are living their lives without the person who is currently incarcerated. We recognize that over 1.2 million people were incarcerated in 2022. It was interesting. They estimate that each individual has 2 to 3 people that are connected to them that would potentially be grieving a loss related to incarceration, which puts us at a number of 3.5 million experiencing grief related to incarceration in the United States alone. And I do want to note, this is interesting, the statistic is different when you do research on loss related to COVID. They were estimating that 6 to 8 people were grieving each individual loss to COVID. So I venture to guess that if you even put those two gauges together, there are absolutely probably more than 3.5 people who are navigating loss specific to incarceration during this time. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that the grief related to incarceration and the grief that those who are experiencing it as a result of that have the capacity to be experiencing some disenfranchised grief. I think it is grief that is not necessarily acknowledged. It is not socially accepted, and we don't have the same capacity to mourn publicly like we do in death losses. And that is similar with non-death losses in general, that they're not publicly mourned in the same way. But I think that variable of the social acceptance and the stigma associated with grief very much impacts that experience. It is grief that is often minimized and not understood by others. When we put the loss and the grief on the responsibility of the grieving person without recognizing the circumstances, when we are making harsh judgments, it makes it hard for people to be able to have their grief witnessed and processed and worked through. And for those who experience disenfranchised grief, we know that that has higher rates of depression. There are going to be increased emotional struggles. They are more likely to withdraw from peers, from family. They're more likely to experience isolation, physical symptoms, and they're more likely to have a prolonged and more complicated grief experience. For those who are incarcerated and navigating that loss, there is also a high rate of incarcerated individuals that experience death loss during that time. Statistically, young men in prison face an increased number of parental deaths. They face having multiple death losses while incarcerated, and there's a potential that they are experiencing higher numbers of traumatic death than those who are not experiencing incarceration. And nearly half of all women experience the death of a loved one while incarcerated. So for those who are navigating loss related to that and potentially navigating death losses in general, that is going to compound that grief experience. And making sure that individuals do have that support, because we know without grief support, they're more likely to have increased challenges and struggle upon release. Ambiguous loss is another variable that I think is important to recognize from this perspective, because it is circumstances that don't necessarily have that same conclusion. There's not that same closure that we expect. We don't have a lot of rituals that are surrounding that. There's not cues that kind of help guide us along in the grief and loss process like we would see in a death loss. Of all losses experienced in relationships, ambiguous loss tend to be the most challenging because it can be unclear and confusing. It's not always known what a time frame is going to be, what the circumstances are. There's a lot of missing pieces for people sometimes. It's challenging because they feel as though they can't problem solve because they might not have the ability to make an impact or do something in the way they could in other instances. And because there's often a lack of resolution. And we know that navigating ambiguous loss is also likely to increase the likelihood of complicated grief. I think this quote is incredibly poignant, and it's the recognition that a prison sentence is not a death, but it can sure feel like one. The amount of pain and heartache you carry when someone is ripped away from your daily life is crazy. I found that in an article when I was doing some of the research in preparation for this program. And I think it's that recognition of how important it is to be able to verbalize and articulate and express that there is so much grief associated with this, that your person is no longer a part of your everyday life. And how do we express this? How do we seek support? Who can we go to when we are navigating the loss of loved ones in our everyday life, but that loss is not necessarily being validated and talked about and supported in the ways that other losses might be in our lives? And making sure people know that it's okay to seek support. It's okay to talk with a counselor, seeking professional support, or getting connected with peer support programs in the community are absolutely ways that people can take care of themselves in the process. And for those of you who are participating in here and are in active roles for being able to be a support person and working with those who are both grieving because as a result of incarceration, because they themselves are incarcerated, or are supporting family members who have incarcerated loved ones, it is how can we support them? What can we do? And the acknowledgement and the recognition for how important it is for people to have an outlet to be able to honestly and openly talk and share their experience, to be a supportive presence without pointing out silver linings, without trying to fix. We are absolutely a culture of fixers, and we want to be able to tell people what they need to do or what they should be doing from a grief and loss perspective. And as a grief counselor and somebody who works in this field on a regular basis, we recognize that the greatest need is for somebody to be able to walk alongside them, to be able to be a supportive presence without trying to fix something that maybe can't be fixed in the way we wish it could be. That recognition and acknowledgement that grief is a lifelong process, and not having an expectation that this is something that we are going to get over, that we are changed by grief and loss experiences. And we experience grief and loss in different ways at different times in our lives. And we can re-experience losses in different times of our own life. We may experience the same loss in different ways, but recognizing it as a process, providing opportunities, saying the name of a deceased person or an absent person, allowing them to still be included, and letting people know that you remember your person, you are thinking about them, you are still maintaining connection to them. I think that that is one gift that we can absolutely give to those who are grieving around us. And not forgetting, we know that grief is something that individuals are going to carry with them. But as support roles, I think oftentimes we check in early on, and then life gets busy again, and we get back to doing our everyday things. And we're not necessarily checking in with the grieving people in our community, in our places of work, and in our lives in the same way as time goes on. So making sure that we are continuing to acknowledge that continued grief process, and checking in and asking how they are, what their grief experience is, and if they could benefit from additional support from us at any point in time.
All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about children and adolescents and the implications of incarceration. I just want to give the caveat that this presentation is, more focused on children who have a caregiver, family member, friend who is incarcerated. But certainly many of these things apply to those children and adolescents who are in the juvenile justice system as well. But more than 2.7 million children in the United States currently have a parent who is in jail or prison. These kids often face a lot of stress, emotional, physical, academic, and financial hardship. Often what you will hear people refer to as ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. And the American Academy of Pediatrics recognizes that. They recognize that having a parent in prison as an ACE. It's a childhood trauma that can lead to poor health and well-being as an adult. Few other considerations is, some kids and youth may also witness their parents' arrests and other stressful events beyond the incarceration, such as a trial or sentencing. They may have bared witness to some of the events that led to the arrest that could be traumatic in of itself. But the important thing to remember is that these children can thrive if they build resiliency and they have the support in their life to do so. So I just want to go through a couple of developmental considerations because grief does look a lot different in kids than it does in adults, and it changes with their developmental stage. And that's especially important when we're talking about grief because our hope is that all kids are going to lead a long, healthy life. Therefore, their grief journey is going to be much longer than an adult's would be. And as kids grow and develop, they reprocess their grief throughout different developmental stages when they reach new milestones. So their journey looks quite different. So for infancy and preschool, so our kids who are, kind of like 4 and under, they may show some regressive behaviors and separation anxiety, and they can sense a change in their environment and primary caregivers. So they may not be able to necessarily say or articulate, I know that usually like my mom is the one who rocks me to sleep and I know what she smells like and I know how her heartbeat feels when I lay on her chest. They don't know how to say that, but they know that mom's not there anymore when she's not doing that. And so they can sense that change and oftentimes will kind of regress to some younger behaviors and have a lot of separation anxiety because they don't have the ability to understand where did my person go? All I know is that they're gone. For our elementary age kids, they're often concerned with security issues. Who is going to take care of me? Am I safe? Am I going to see you again? You're here to take care of me. Are you going to be leaving me too? And they may not be eating or sleeping well, which if any of you are parents, you know that when your kid is hangry, that's about one of the hardest things to handle as an adult. And they recognize the change in their family system. They know that the person who is no longer there due to the loss of incarceration, that things are different. They're functioning different. Maybe it was dad who woke up and packed lunches for school and walked the kids to the bus, and he's no longer there to do that. And so what does that look like? Who's going to walk me to the bus? Am I still getting on the bus? They're processing all of these changes in their life and what it's going to look like for them. In middle school, which is a super tricky time already as a kid, all you want to do is fit in. You're trying to figure out who you are, who your friends are, and then you have a loss and you realize that it has on your family, but also on how different you are from some of your peers. and you kind of feel like you have that big label on you as the grieving kid or the kid whose mom went to prison. And that's a hard thing as a kid to handle and to deal with, especially as Donna spoke to earlier. There's that stigma around the loss experienced with incarceration. There can be a lot of shame, a lot of finger pointing from people of like, well, they must have done something to end up there. So why do you even feel sad or bad about it? But at the end of the day, it's not really anybody's place to judge anyone's grief journey, right? It's individual to their unique individual. And so these are kids that may show some undesirable behaviors to gain the attention. I always like to use the word undesirable instead of bad. I am of the very firm belief that there are no bad kids. There are good kids who have hard times. And when you have an ACE experience, yeah, you're having a really hard time. And so those are the kids who often are the ones being called to the principal's office or maybe being suspended or kicked out of summer camp or whatever it might be. And not to say that all of their behaviors are okay, but it's the fact that they have all of these feelings inside of them that are complex and difficult to understand. And they don't have the support or the skills to process them. And so they kind of resort to these undesirable behaviors to get them out. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about that resilience piece. And then, of course, our high schoolers, our oldest group, they really understand the ramifications of the loss and how it's going to impact the future. They're in the process of breaking away from their family, which is a really normal developmental task. Maybe you're getting your license and you're starting to drive. Maybe you're starting to think about plans for after high school, going to college or enlisting in the military or whatever it might look like, getting a job out of state. And when, especially with the loss of a parent or parent figure, it's very common for these high schoolers to try to assume the role of the person who is incarcerated or who is gone. It's a very stereotypical thing, but the older brother is like, okay, well, I'm the man of the house now. I need to make sure that my mom's safe and my little siblings are safe. There's no way that I can leave next year and leave them here on their own. Or, maybe the oldest sister is becoming the little mother and is like, okay, I'm in charge of bath time and bedtime and packing lunches. And so there's kind of an extra weight placed on their shoulder, simply because they might be the oldest sibling or oldest cousin in a group. And I would love more than anything to say that we can give these kids permission not to do that and to say, hey, you don't need to take that on, you're still a kid yourself. But the reality is sometimes that's what has to happen. Whether that's because the other parent works two jobs or they work night shift, or the other parent isn't really able to be there for them in the way that they need. And so very much recognizing that this age group has a lot of extra pressure on them at times. So navigating some changes as a kid or adolescent, when you have a parent or loved one who's incarcerated, structure can be really helpful. So knowing what to expect, especially with younger kids, but even with our adolescents and high schoolers, they think they're adults and they think that they don't need structure and that they can make all of their own decisions. But we know that they're not. And so structure and boundaries are actually what's really, really good for them. It's what they thrive for. Oftentimes when there are those undesirable behaviors, it can be because that's what they're craving. They're craving structure, they're craving boundaries. It might be hard for them to see their friends with their families. Again, that goes back to that stigma and that shame that comes along with things. And so that's why it is so important to talk about it, and to have support in place, and have awareness that this is a grief reaction for kids. It's not just kids who, you know, you might hear people talking and being like, oh yeah, they just have a real messed up home situation. That's really minimizing what they are going through. They're grieving. And like I mentioned, those regressions and roles within the family. So, kind of on the opposite spectrum, like we talked about with the high schooler, there can be a lot of regressions where some kids, regardless of age, may resort to being more of like the baby figure, a lot of the whining, a lot of the separation, a lot of the feeling like I can't do anything by myself. And that's the way that they are seeking that safety, that connection, to the family that they still have present with them. And then, of course, recognizing the secondary losses. And these are things that kids and youth are going to grieve as well. So maybe it's having to go to a new school because you had to move. It's not having a secondary income, so you can't play club soccer. It's all of the secondary losses that happen as a result, of the loss that you've experienced. A few things to note on feelings and communication. Each child grieves in his or her own way. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. You can be mad, sad, hangry, whatever it is. All of that's okay. The caveat I always give to that is there is no right or wrong way to grieve, but there are safe and unsafe ways to grieve. So it is okay to be mad, that your mom is in jail. It's not okay to be mad and hit your brother when you feel mad. So there's a way to okay the feeling without okaying a behavior that is unsafe. And modeling a healthy expression of emotions. Emotions are hard. They're tricky for adults. For kids, they're impossible sometimes. There's nothing worse when you're a kid than when you feel like, are my emotions wrong? Are they not safe for me to have? And so that's usually one of the biggest pieces of advice, or one of the biggest recommendations I give to caregivers is let them see you grieve. Let them see you cry. Let them see you be angry, scared, happy. When they know that you feel that way, it makes it feel more normal for them to feel how they're feeling. I think with a lot of good intention, one of the things we hear is like, I'm just trying to stay strong for them. I can't break down in front of them. I don't want them to worry about me. But the fact of the matter is, the kids are already worried. They're already questioning everything. And so if you're able to show some vulnerability with them and your emotions, it can be really powerful for them. And then something that's really tricky is kids ask a lot of questions, right? And again, caregivers oftentimes want to be able to answer those questions. Like Donna said, we're fixers. We want to fix things. We want to make it better. But acknowledging and accepting that you may not be able to answer every question or solve every problem. It doesn't mean you're not doing a great job. It doesn't mean that you don't care to find out the answer. It's just sometimes there isn't one. And so it's always okay to say, I wonder that same thing too. I wish I knew the answer, but I don't. So, how can we help? If there's a way to help the child to have one committed, stable relationship with a supportive adult, whether that's a parent, a grandparent, aunt, uncle, teacher, coach, there are lots of people who can show up and care for a kid. Consider helping the child connect with their incarcerated parent. Again, if this is something that the child or teen is wanting, is looking for, and there's a way to do it, it's going to be really helpful for them. If this is something that they're not ready to do for whatever reason, I think it's important not to push it and to really let the child or teen guide you on what is helpful for them. Um, Again, one of the things I've heard from some folks sometimes is like, well, I just don't want them to regret it later down the line. And it's like, well, maybe they will, maybe they won't. But when we force kids to do something they're not ready for in their grief journey, it typically doesn't go well. Um, and then encouraging skill building activities. So helping them gain mastery over something. And it can be, something as simple as like learning how to pour your cereal in the morning on your own. Like that sounds really kind of simple and silly, but it can be really impactful when a kid feels like I have something to contribute to this world. It gives them a lot of confidence and a lot of empowerment. And then, of course, talking to them about normal grief and loss reactions, like, talk about the person who is incarcerated and how's it affected them. That these are some feelings that may be normal. These are some things that other, people have said about how they're feeling with their grief. I wonder if you've ever felt that way before. The more we talk about it, the better it'll be for these kids and teens to feel like they're not going through this alone. So we kind of ran through everything real fast because we had a lot of questions last time and ran out of time. And so Donna and I were like, we are not doing that today. We are going to answer every question. And so we would love to hear from you guys now.
Awesome. And I did look over the chat and I did not see Caitlin or Donna anything that stuck out. I know we had a Mr. Livingston that said he may have had a question along with Tisa. So we'll see if they chime in here.
And I'll piggyback kind of on what Caitlin was saying at the end in that acknowledgement of talking with them about the normal grief and loss reactions. I think oftentimes having the language to use. So talking about that, the grief and loss, but using words like grief and loss, using words to identify the emotions. I think oftentimes kids and adults alike are feeling things that we don't necessarily have the language for, or that it doesn't fit in this circumstance the way it might have fit in another circumstance. And I think anytime we have language that we can acknowledge and verbalize something that we are thinking and feeling, it gives us the capacity to control ourselves versus the emotion or the feeling controlling us. Once we can identify it, we can do something with it. And I think it's so important to be using language that can be helpful for kids, adults, those who are grieving, and to give those that we are supporting who are grieving language that can be helpful and healthy for them.
Yeah. And I think too, with language and feelings, like it's a really complicated thing. One of the things that I found really like helpful and effective, especially when working with kids and even teenagers, is kind of going back to like the senses for them. Like they might not know, they've heard anxiety, but they might not know really what it feels like, or they might not really know what it feels like to feel melancholy. So if you can kind of go to like the senses of like, okay, like when your body's like feeling really hot and like you feel like you have a lot of energy and like you're going to kind of burst out of your skin, like maybe you're starting to feel angry, but they don't have necessarily the development to like put those puzzle pieces in place of like, oh yeah, I felt really angry when that happened. All they know is that all of a sudden they just kind of like exploded. And so if you can kind of go back to like, again, a body scan with them of like, when in your grief process, like where do you feel it in your body, and kind of helping give them that language, they can take ownership of it.
Okay. It looks like Gabe had a question. He said, what would be the best way to show how to empathize with a child and also teach that to the parent properly?
That's a great question. Um, Empathy is something that I could talk about forever, but I won't. Um, the best way to empathize with a child is to listen to them. I'm sure some of you guys have probably heard of Brene Brown and like the difference between sympathy and empathy. And, I won't go into that whole thing, but empathy is listening. It's not trying to fix. It's not trying to say, oh man, like that's really, really tough, and putting kind of how you feel about the situation on them. It could be as simple as saying, like, hey, Jess, I heard that, your uncle was sentenced yesterday and is going to be in prison for a while. I know you guys were really close. I just want you to know that I'm here for you. That's a really empathetic response. It's not fixing, it's not assuming, it's just showing up and saying, hey, I'm here for you. Um, and then to teach that to the parent properly, do you mean like teach the parent how to be empathetic?
Yeah, it says, and also teach that to the parent properly. I'm not.
Yeah.
That,
I
that
think
that's how I interpreted it.
Okay, yeah. I think it's more, again, just again, like as a parent myself, I can say, like when my kid scrapes his knee, like the first thing I want to do is say, "Oh, you're okay. You're fine. You're okay." But in that moment, he doesn't feel okay. In that moment, something scary happened to him and he's crying. So if I say, "Hey, like you're okay, like it's fine. Don't worry about it." I'm minimizing his feelings and I'm teaching him that his feelings are wrong and not to be trusted. So instead I say, hey, like that felt really scary and I'm here for you. We can get through this together. And then magically he stops crying and is fine. Whereas if I'm like, hey, you're fine, it's more of like, I'm not fine. So I think it's just, again, it's showing up for them, but not showing out, if that makes sense.
Makes a lot of
Um,
sense. Carla says, do you have any handouts or any form of information that we can share with parents, especially returning citizens that are trying to rebuild relationships with their kiddos?
yeah, I think so. We have a couple of handouts that we use in our peer support groups. And one of them is kind of on like family connections and relationship building. And so I'm happy to send that via email. I don't know if Ernest, you would be the best person or how to get that out, but I'm happy to share that with folks.
Absolutely. We'll get it to the right people. We'll get it to the
Yeah.
right folks. So there was another question that says, just was wondering if there's a model that assists with grief of the children and supports for the family unit to identify and heal. Also, having the words at someone's disposal to describe slash express feelings is important. Do you use expression charts or other visual tools?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the model that we use here at Fernside is a family model. What we do is we offer peer support groups to kids 3 through the end of high school. And then we offer support groups for their adults in their life as well. Um, and so they're with groups or they're with peers that are going through similar experiences to them. And then throughout different points throughout our program year, we bring the families all together, as opposed to splitting up into the peer support groups and do some family centered group work. Um, as far as the tools, we use a ton of tools. We use charts. We are huge book people. I love books. I think they're one of the best resources for kids and adults, especially with like technology these days. Like going back to a simple basic book is actually like really refreshing for a lot of people. We're a very expressive arts based organization. And so it's a lot of books, it's a lot of art, a lot of games, and a lot of music, to give kids and our adults some alternative ways to share and process.
Great. Starting to get some emails, so I'm going to definitely note those.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see here. Someone had a statement, Gabe. He says, I find adults have just enough as tough of time to express or identify emotions as children do. So the other part of my question was about how to empower or
Mm.
teach those adults or parents so they can better identify those difficult emotions.
Absolutely. And I think that we recognize that generational difference. Like youth today do have more opportunities to identify emotions than we may have in earlier generations. I think that we are definitely being more intentional to include emotional language in earlier settings in school and in other environments. So for adults that are navigating these challenges, we're using a lot of the same tools to help them identify their emotions. I think we always have to understand the why before we can teach and take on that role of teaching somebody else. So, in the work that we do with adults, it is using visual cues. It is using emotion. We have an emotion wheel here that we have used. We've used the picture graphs before that show faces with expression because if adults are working with kids and they can master a tool, then they can share it and they can do those things together. But I do think it is incredibly important to start with the basics to help the adults be able to identify and react to the emotions that they're experiencing in healthy ways because they can talk kids through it, but then they're also able to model it. And I think that the key is not only telling people what they can do, but for kids to have the opportunity to see that in action in their everyday lives. So really working on plans that the adults can take on initiative for themselves and then be able to share those similar experiences with their kids as they gain mastery.
Awesome. Awesome. I think it's Destiny. I might be pronouncing that wrong. I apologize if I did. But she stated, do you have or recommend any games or activities that can help identify emotions? I have found that play therapy works well for parents with their children.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big believer and lover of play therapy myself as well. We have, uh, gosh, we have what we call our Fernside idea book, which is a whole book we've made of different expressive art activities that really do focus a lot on emotions and grief and a lot of the things that come with them. I'm happy to send some of those through that email as well. Just a few like off the top of my head that I really love. The the Color Monster is a great book. In My Heart is a really wonderful book. And Grief is an Elephant is also a really great book that I've been using a lot lately. And then for games, like we often will get creative and kind of like make our own. So one of the games that we do is grief Jenga. And so we have Jenga, and then we just write questions on it um, that are related to grief emotions. We put like some fun ones in there as well, so it doesn't get too heavy. And that's a really normal thing. A lot of kids play Jenga, and it's a way that's safe for them, and so it's something that like the whole family could do together.
Okay.
I'll piggyback on that one. One of my favorite books is The Rabbit Listened. And I think that being able to read that one when we're really trying to emphasize the importance of people being able to find their voice and being able to articulate that. I got that one
Awesome.
from Caitlin.
I like that one.
So Story Chain, and we've partnered with this organization called the Story Chain Story, and they actually cater to that very point of dealing with children whose parents are incarcerated and dealing with their grief. And
Oh, that's awesome.
I'm sorry.
I said that's awesome.
Yeah, so I'd be
Yeah.
remiss if I didn't just share. Their little connection is they connect the reader and the listener through community outreach. So they do this through audio technology. So they'll have the parent that is incarcerated read a story to, using technology, audio technology, MP3, and then take that, put it in like a teddy bear format, something that way, and allow the child to listen to that
Oh, that's
outside.
really cool.
And I just think that's awesome for, not only just for the incarcerated parents, parents of children with disabilities, or families of senior living, and assisted living. It's just a wonderful process. And I just wanted to put that out there because that also soothes that dealing with those feelings that we can't name.
Yeah, that's
Well, and the
wonderful.
other thing that I applaud Story Chain because we long for that connection to our person. And so
Absolutely.
it is a way to bridge a connection, to be able to hear a voice, to be able to physically hold something that is representing their voice and telling a story. I think that that is an incredible gift to be able to give the grieving
Absolutely.
child or the grieving person, and something for the person that's not able to be present to be able to do something with their grief. It provides an outlet for them as well. So that is remarkable work.
Awesome. And I had a question for me. I've had a lot of men and women alike that I've helped support, peer support wise, who were also justice impacted. And what I get a lot of is some of them, they say, well, Ernest, I don't come back home to a situation that's fair for me to engage with my children right away, be it as it may, whatever reason, but they don't do that initial connection, be it because of separation problems or whatever it may be. And they say the way that they describe how they're feeling, it sounds like grief, but they're grieving they're grieving their child, and that gap of time that they don't get to spend with them. Is there a way that they can approach that and deal with that, or is it the same skills and the same tools that we would use for normal grief?
I think that it's a different aspect of grief. I think that we do grieve time that was lost. That we missed things in their life because we weren't able to be present. But I think that we can use some of those skills, storytelling, spending time together, revisiting, and giving the kids the opportunity to share stories about the things that they did. And outside of my professional world as a grief counselor, I was a foster parent for many years as well. And so we did life books so that, the parents have the story of what the child was doing in their time out of home, but also so the kids can help share that story. So I think a life book is a good way. And that can be something that can be started when the separation happens. I think a parent that is away can also tell some stories. It might have to be modified and adjusted to the developmental age of the person or the child that they're reconnecting with, to give them some ideas of things that they were doing to reassure some of their safety or different aspects when they were away from them. But I do think tools like that to acknowledge, like, I missed this, but I want to know as much as I can. I want to be a part of that. And then to assure those connections for moving forward can be good tools.
Wow,
Is that
fantastic. Thank
helpful?
you. Thank you for sharing that. James Himesworth, he shared that the book that was very helpful to him as an adult, as he looked back at his unprocessed grief from the loss of his father when he was 13, was the book The Loss That Is Forever by Maxine Harris, The
Mhm.
Lifelong Impact of the Early Death of a Mother or a Father. So thanks for
Yeah,
sharing that, James.
yeah, that's great.
And I think that so much of what we always hope to impart when we are talking about grief and loss is the fact that we are changed by the grief and loss experiences that we have. And so we are changed, and grief is
Absolutely.
something that is forever.
Yes.
And grief is going to resurface at different times in different lives. But I think that the more we do to help people understand in the midst of grief that this is something we are learning to live with, and that the tools and skills that we're learning now, we're going to carry with us, um, and start breaking away from that idea that grief and loss is something that we need to fix, but it's something rather that we need to carry, and that it's something that we build a toolbox for these losses, because they are going to build over the course of time. in lots of different aspects and areas of our lives.
Absolutely. Let's see if I see any more questions here, because I'd hate to give these 4 minutes back. Let's see. This is so good. I love this
I wish
topic.
I could see everybody else's faces on camera, right?
I know. I wish we could as well. I just really wanted to take a personal moment to thank you both, Donna, Caitlin. This has been more impactful to me than you know. I'll put it that way. I recently suffered a loss, and the more I learn about this, it's not, you never become a professional at grief, right? And I love what you said. It really validates that it's forever thing, and it's something that we'll always manage, deal, and cope with if we allow ourselves the chance to grow through it. So I just want to express my gratitude for both of you for sharing your expertise in the field and helping us understand that it's a good thing to lean in, but with intent. Be intentional about how you approach it, how you feel it, and how you process it. So I want to say thank you so much to both of you for sharing. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for being honest and authentic with your grief experiences. And, I think that we often in this field, in working as professionals where we are encountering grief and loss, we also have to extend some grace and compassion to ourselves, because knowing loss and living loss can be very different experiences. And I think that once we have that understanding, that it does help us extend some kindness and compassion to ourselves in the process as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So they said, thank you for all of the awesome information. Continue the great work.
Oh, that's great.
Ladies, thank you. Thank you. A lot of thank yous and appreciation going on. I've noted
all the work you all do.
And if we can serve as a resource, please don't hesitate to reach out and get connected. Reba has our contact information.
Yeah, I can go ahead and I can send the slides and some of those other resources to Reba, and then she can distribute. Does that sound like a good plan?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you all for being with us today.
All right, have a good rest of the afternoon.
All right, and please, just one final thing I want to share. This is the last session of the day, so if you please join us at our host site on Thursday if you registered. That is tomorrow. We look forward to seeing you. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great evening.